by the way, how it's also
So far,
yeah.
all right, listen please. In this unit on homeostasis, we are sort of broken this up into different important functions that living things have to accomplish. So we finished with one. We just finished with talking about how do living things obtain the materials they need to stay alive. How do they obtain nutrients? How do they obtain oxygen? And so forth. Now what we're going to start to talk about is then how do they move those substances around within them? Right? And so we'll talk about transport. And we'll compare, as we did in our other groups, we'll compare plants and some simple animals, and then we'll talk about humans as well, and go through those and sort of compare them so we can understand a little bit about how different types of organisms have adapted to be able to move things around. So we'll start with plants. So we've talked already about plant transport somewhat, so this is just real brief. Let's see. All right, so plant, you know that? What is that?
Mother Nature.
No.
Oh, wait.
The tree from Pocahontas.
No. That's what I'm asking you, Meg.
I know what the S word is. It's like probably something from like...
Nobody? This is sad. Yes, it is actually from a book first. Ah, you're getting there, Karina.
Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
It is, what is it called, this creature?
The tree.
No.
Big wing.
It is an ent.
Looks like a tree.
E-N-T.
Yeah.
This is tree beard.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I know.
Anyway, go watch the series. If you're looking for something to do over break, take a full day and watch the extended version of all 3 Lord of the Rings movies and both of the Hobbits. That should take up half your vacation.
That's a no, I'm not doing that.
I'm looking at Florida.
All right. And one day?
I'm literally
One day.
A tree.
So in plants, material needs to be moved around from one part to another. So some plants are really small. There are some plants without any vascular tissue at all. Basically, they can absorb the nutrients and materials they need directly from the air, from water. Those are non-vascular plants, but that's not the majority of plants. Most plants do have what we call vascular tissue. And this vascular tissue is what allows things to move around inside of the plant. So to start, we can think about the roots of a plant. The roots of a plant are pretty extensive usually. We don't often think about it because they're obviously underground and we don't see them a lot, but people often say that the underground portion of, for example, a tree is just about as large as the above ground portion. So that's what you see in this picture. And the roots of plants are adapted to fulfill several purposes. They are anchor the plant and keep it, attached to the soil so it doesn't blow over. Sometimes if there's an extreme storm, you might hike through the woods and see trees that have been blown over and their whole root surface has been exposed. Oftentimes that happens in areas with shallow soil where the roots don't grow very deep, but they grow along just under the surface, and those can be blown over pretty easily. The roots also absorb water, absorb minerals from the soil, nutrients from the soil, and through the roots. And attached to the end of the roots are these tiny little, very fine, what are called root hairs, which give a large surface area where those plants can absorb those materials. Also, oftentimes, material is stored in the roots. So when there's an abundance of, for example, sugar, oftentimes plants will send that excess material down to the roots to be stored so that in the following season, those nutrients can be retrieved and used to start growth up. The xylem is the tissue that carries water through the plant. Typically, we think of it as carrying water upward because the water that goes into the plant comes in through the roots and then has to be conducted to other parts of the plant through this xylem tissue. And there's a term called transpiration. This is when water leaves the plant. Typically it leaves through the stomates. Okay? And that process is called transpiration. And sort of as the water moves up through this vascular tissue, it drags along sort of the water that's coming in through the roots because of the cohesive nature of water molecules. The tissue that carries sugars, dissolved sugars, is the phloem. Often, this isn't entirely accurate to say mostly downward. I mean, typically, because the sugars are made in the leaves of plants, mainly, which are usually located in the upper portions of the plant, those exposed to the sun. And so often those sugars need to be sent to the various parts of the plant to provide energy. If we look at the interior of the stem of a plant, now this is typically what you would see, an epidermal layer of tissue on the outside. In woody plants, it's made of strong sort of woody material, lignin. There's the wood inside, if this is a woody plant, okay, called the pith, the cortex. And then there are these vascular bundles. Each of these vascular bundles is tissue conducting material from one part of the plant to another. And here's sort of a close-up. What you have on the inside is the xylem, where you have water moving through those tubes. You have a layer of cambium, of growing cells in between. And then you have the phloem towards the outside, which conducts sugar. And so you probably, I don't know if you did, when I was in elementary school, the only field trip we ever took was to a maple farm. Has anyone ever been to some place where they produce maple syrup?
Yeah.
So what is the process like? How do you get maple syrup?
Tap the tree.
Tap the tree.
How is the flow?
Yeah, so when you tap a maple tree, most types of trees don't have an annual sap flow, but maples do. And when temperatures change in the springtime, pressure inside of the tree builds. And so if you insert a metal piece through the bark of the tree into this phloem, as the higher pressure inside of this tree forces that sap to move, some of it is forced out through the tap, and then you can collect that. So in the old days, they used to collect it in little buckets. Okay? Nowadays, if you've ever driven by a big stand of maple trees where they're producing maple syrup, you may see like plastic tubing that stretches from tree to tree to tree, and it basically just collects all of the sap that's running and brings it all to one central location. And so you can remove some of that sap from the maple tree, and it's about 3% in maple trees. It's about 3 to a maximum of 10% sucrose. So if you were to pour sap on your pancakes, basically it'd be like pouring water on your pancakes. You just end up with a bowl of mush. So what do they have to do to sap to make syrup? Carter? They boil. So they take huge amounts of this sap that they've extracted from the maple trees, boil it, evaporate away most of the water until you're left with a very concentrated, sugary solution that we call maple syrup. So you're basically getting that sap from the phloem of those trees. All right, let's talk about animals now. So transport in animals. We've already talked a little bit about earthworms in the past. We'll continue with sort of the same organisms. We'll talk about earthworms, we'll talk about insects, and then we'll talk about humans. So earthworms have what we call a closed circulatory system. All of their blood is contained within blood vessels. We'll compare this to a different type of circulatory system, open circulatory system. Earthworms are interested, they don't have any red blood cells inside of their blood. Instead, their hemoglobin is just floating along in the plasma. It fulfills the same function as hemoglobin. It attaches to oxygen, carries it from one place to another, but it's actually not on specialized red blood cells. They have what are called aortic arches. It's sort of like their heart. It's not technically a heart, but they contract to pump blood through the circulatory system of the worm, and that brings blood to all the various parts of the worm, distributing it to all of the tissue within the earthworm. So that's a closed circulatory system. An example of an open circulatory system are insects. So in an open circulatory system, sometimes the blood is contained within vessels, and sometimes it's just surrounding all of the tissue outside of vessels, sort of bathing the rest of the insect's body cavity. And so if you were to look at an insect circulatory system, okay, they have sort of this dorsal blood vessel, the dorsal aorta, can contract to force blood through it, and then that blood is sort of pumped into this body cavity where it just is sort of surrounding the tissue inside of the grasshopper. Interesting thing about the insect's blood is it doesn't have hemoglobin and it doesn't carry oxygen. If you remember when we talked about oxygen in insects, they take oxygen directly in through those openings in the abdomen, takes it into their tissue to supply oxygen. So the oxygen for insects isn't coming from the blood. It's carrying nutrients and waste products, but not oxygen. And as the insect moves around, some of that blood gets forced back into this dorsal aorta, where it can then sort of loop around. They don't have any capillaries because the blood is just sort of surrounding all of their tissue. If we compare the two, closed circulatory system versus open circulatory system, you'll see the difference. Blood is always contained within vessels in the earthworm, whereas in the grasshopper, it spills out of those vessels and surrounds the organs. Those are two adaptations. So we'll spend most of our time about the human circulatory system. We have specialized organs and the circulatory system to allow for the transport of blood and materials throughout the body. Who could name that movie?
The movie.
Yeah. Indiana Jones, Temple of Doom. Anyone got to know this connection? No? This is a band called Heart. They're from like the 70s and 80s. Anyway. Human transport system is a closed circulatory system. More like the earthworm than the grasshopper. Blood is in blood vessels all the time. Our heart is a 4-chambered pump to move material, move this blood around the body. Attached to the heart are arteries, veins, capillaries, various types of blood vessels. And those blood vessels are filled with blood. We have about 4 to 6 liters of blood in our body. And blood technically is a type of tissue. It's a fluid tissue, meaning kind of a liquid tissue that contains various parts, red blood cells, hemoglobin, white blood cells, platelets, etc. So our blood fulfills several functions in our body. Obviously, it distributes nutrients. So our blood carries glucose and amino acids and oxygen and carbon dioxide from one place to another. It's also important in fighting infection. So our immune system is a part of our circulatory system. So it helps to fight off infection. Our circulatory system helps to seal up any damage through clotting of blood. And our circulatory system also helps to redistribute heat throughout our body. So blood vessels can open up or constrict to redistribute heat when a person is suffering from hypothermia, their circulatory system sort of adjusts and they keep as much of that warm blood as possible in their core for their vital organs, their heart, their lungs, their brain. That's why people often will start to get frostbite on their extremities first, because as you start to get hypothermia, your body withdraws much of that blood from your extremities to keep it in the important parts that are necessary for your survival. Our blood makes up about 8% of our body by weight. If we were to look at that blood more carefully, we would see that it's not just, a red liquid. It's made of several components. The liquid part is called the plasma, and it's about 55% of the blood. The rest of it is the other parts, 45%. If we look at the plasma, most of that is water with some dissolved proteins and other solutes. If we look at the formed elements of the blood, we have red blood cells, we have white blood cells, and we have platelets. The white blood cells come in different types that we'll eventually talk a little bit about. The immune system is quite complicated with many different types of cells accomplishing many different types of functions. But you can see here the different types of white blood cells and what their makeup is in the white blood cells. So let's talk about the parts of the blood. The plasma is the liquid part. You're going to take a vial of blood and centrifuge it, spin it around very quickly. It separates out into various components. The plasma looks like this yellowish sort of liquid. Here's a bag for transfusion of plasma only. Usually I donate blood fairly regularly, and they just sent an email this week saying, in your area there is a desperate need for plasma. So sometimes you could go and donate only plasma. Other times you typically might donate whole blood. Just depends on what the needs are and so forth. That's what plasma looks like. And its job really is to be a carrier of the other parts.
How do you transmit? Get only plasma?
Yeah, they have like a machine that separates plasma from the other components.
So you have to get the blood first.
Yes, yes. Yeah, they can't like just extract the plasma. It's a special machine. And actually, sometimes you could donate. Usually, you have to be sort of bigger in size. You can do double red cell donation, where they extract your blood. I think they extract twice as much. They then separate the plasma from the red blood cells. They put the plasma back into you, but keep the two red blood cell components of your blood. Because they don't want to remove that much volume of your blood. They wouldn't remove 2 full donations from you, but if they put the plasma back in, then it's okay. If you're a bigger person, you could donate double the red blood cells. The plasma, like we said, is 90% water, 7% protein. There are some things carried within just the plasma. Okay, most of the carbon dioxide that's transported by our blood is carried in the plasma, and it has an important function because in the plasma, CO2 is converted to bicarbonate. And bicarbonate acts as what we call a buffer. Buffers are substances which maintain pH within a pretty narrow range. If you have a buffered solution, you could add quite a bit of strong acid to it, and the pH actually won't change very much. Or you could add quite a bit of base, and the pH doesn't change very much. So this allows our blood pH to stay at a relatively constant level, this buffering aspect of bicarbonate. And that's this reaction that you see here. Okay. The red blood cell portion of our blood, it carries oxygen and some of the carbon dioxide is carried on the red blood cells. Red blood cells have hemoglobin, an iron-containing molecule which actually bonds to the oxygen to allow the red blood cells to transport it. So red blood cells are small. There's about 5 million in a single cubic milliliter of blood. So that's a lot of them. They are constantly being created in our bone marrow and constantly being destroyed by what organ? Spleen. You just learned about that in your case study, right? That the red blood cells that are sort of used up go to the spleen to be destroyed, and the hemoglobin gets processed, extracted. What causes jaundice? What compound? Bilirubin, yes. So the red blood cell's job is to bring oxygen around through the body. Platelets are another component of the blood. Platelets are smaller than the red blood cells. They're not cells. They're cell fragments and proteins. These are what a clump of platelets look like in a smear of red blood cells. Their purpose is to help our blood clot. And our blood clotting is important when we have any kind of damage to our circulatory system. If you get a cut, for example, and you're bleeding, it's because you've damaged blood vessels inside of your body. And what happens is you have damage is these platelets respond, they start to sort of clump together and seal off the damage to your blood cells, trapping white blood cells, trapping red blood cells, and sort of forming this net slowly over a period of time until you stop bleeding. And then eventually the blood vessel can heal itself. So that process stops you from bleeding. Requires vitamin K. The platelets require vitamin K in order to be produced. So sometimes if a person had a vitamin K deficiency, they may suffer from a clotting disease, or their blood does not clot properly. Sometimes people are born with genetic diseases in which platelets aren't formed properly, or certain parts of the process break down, and that causes what we call hemophilia. Hemophilia, when your blood does not clot properly, leads to a person bleeding excessively. So if a person with hemophilia gets a cut, maybe it's a routine cut that another person would stop bleeding and heal pretty quickly. A person with hemophilia doesn't stop bleeding quickly at all. And so any sort of severe cut could lead to a large loss of blood. People with hemophilia bruise very easily for the same reason. Really, a bruise is just bleeding underneath the skin, and so they bruise very easily. Hemophilia affected the royal family as well in England, when because it is a genetic disease, and it's a recessive genetic disease, because of the trying to maintain royal bloodlines, the monarchs would marry, first cousins and so forth, and so that leads to sort of these recessive genetic diseases becoming more and more common, and affected the royal family and had several children with hemophilia. There's also the opposite problem. Sometimes a person's blood clots too often or at the wrong time, and that's dangerous as well, because if a blood clot forms internally in our blood vessels, that can be dangerous because it restricts the flow of blood in certain parts of the body. Okay, that's called a thrombus. Sometimes a blood clot forms and then circulates through the blood, and if that blood clot that's moving around through the body lodges somewhere, like in the heart, it can cause a heart attack. If it lodges to the blood vessels supplying the brain with blood, it can cause a stroke. So these are dangerous situations. Sometimes people that have blood clots like this might be placed on a medication that reduces their clotting. Sometimes they're called like a blood thinner, and that's one of the treatments for that. Then we have the white blood cells. We'll talk about them more extensively at the end of this unit, because we talk about the immune system separately. But white blood cells are our body's immune system. They are nucleated. So white blood cells have a nucleus. Red blood cells have no nucleus. They are typically less abundant than red blood cells. They're similar in size. But they actually increase dramatically when we have some sort of active infection. If you have strep throat or an ear infection or infection in a cut, your white blood cell production ramps up to help defend against these pathogens. They do a variety of things. The immune system is very complex. There's 5 types of white blood cells: monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, neutrophils, and they have a role. They all sort of work together to do different things, to provide long-term immunity, to mark pathogenic cells for destruction, to engulf and destroy pathogens. So they have a whole variety of jobs to do. Kind of interesting how they work. Here you have white blood cell engulfing some rod-shaped bacteria. This is the white blood cell, basically destroying these bacteria. Here's another example of white blood cell. They're reaching out, grabbing onto these bacteria, trying to destroy them. All right, so let's talk about the heart just a bit. So you learned all about the heart in 7th grade. Hopefully you remember some of that. The heart is a 2-sided pump where oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is kept entirely separate. The right side of the heart is the side that receives the deoxygenated blood and pumps it to where? Deoxygenated blood must be pumped to the lungs. It's deoxygenated. It needs to recharge, gain new oxygen. So it goes to the lungs. Then it goes where? No. Back to the heart. Which side? Yes. And then it gets pumped everywhere else. So the right side of the heart receives the deoxygenated blood, sends it off to the lungs to get recharged. That blood comes back into the heart to get pumped all over. But the heart itself, it needs blood. It can't get oxygen from the blood inside of it that is pumping. So it needs its own blood vessels called the coronary arteries. They surround the heart, providing the muscle with blood to keep working. We'll talk more about those when we talk about some heart problems. But if you have damage to these blood vessels, that can be very dangerous. So you've probably been to the doctor. They take your blood pressure. Put that cuff on your arm, pump it up. Your blood pressure is a measurement of the pressure your blood is putting on your arteries. And it has 2 numbers, right? 110 over 60, or 120 over 80. Those numbers are measurements of your blood pressure at 2 different times. The higher number is called the systole. This is when your heart contracts and is forcing blood into your arteries. Obviously, that exerts a higher pressure on your arteries. When your heart when the ventricles relax, the pressure reduces. That's the second number, the diastole, okay? During when your ventricles have relaxed. It's measured with a sphygmomanometer, blood pressure cuff. And so if you've gone to the doctor and the nurse is checking your blood pressure, put that cuff on your arm. What else do they need besides the cuff? A stethoscope. And so they're listening right on in the crook of your elbow while they pump up the cuff up here. Basically, they pump that cuff up strong enough so that they cannot hear your heartbeat anymore. So what that means is the pressure in the cuff is strong enough to exert the pressure on your arteries. And then they turn that little dial, right, your hand's falling asleep, they turn the dial to let the air out of the cuff, and then that's when they're listening. They're listening to hear when your heart rate comes back again. And that's when the pressures are equal, that's the top number. And then they let the air come out, and then there's another little bump when it reaches diastole, and they take down that number, and that's the lower number. That's what they're doing when they're measuring blood pressure. Your heart beats, depends on lots of factors, but it can beat from, you know, mid-40s per minute to 160, 80, 200 beats per minute, depending on, are you exercising, are you resting, and so forth. And so it's controlled by a bundle of nerve tissue called the pacemaker that establishes your heartbeat, not your heart rest. It's between the right atrium and the ventricle, and it adjusts your heart rate depending on what your body needs. You can measure your heart rate. Again, we felt our pulse earlier in the year. Like some devices like Apple Watch can measure your heart rate. So for example, today my high heart rate was 178 beats per minute. Resting heart rate 50 beats per minute. Right now it's 74. And so what this does is it has this little light and it shines through your skin, and every time your heart beats, the reflection of that light into the watch changes slightly, and that's how it's measuring your heart rate. The newest Apple Watch can actually measure also your heart rhythm, which is typically measured in EKG. You've seen like a graph like on Grey's Anatomy or something when they're in the operating room, the graph going. That's your heart rhythm, because sometimes people have irregular heart rhythm. Okay, like an AED device, a defibrillator, is used to sort of shock the heart and restarting its rhythm. The newest Apple Watch can actually measure your heart rhythm. I know someone that their father has some heart issues, and so they bought their father the newest Apple Watch. And now, if he goes into AFib, if his heart rate is, if his heart rhythm is off, his watch alerts him so that he can call a doctor. If he was unconscious, it will actually call the doctor for them, or call 911 for them, and it also activates the location tracking, so they know where he is. So it's actually an interesting device to help in those situations, especially if you do somebody that has some serious heart problem. So let's talk about the heart here, and then we'll stop with this. So just a review from 7th grade, heart anatomy. Two sides of the heart. It's, again, the right side. Yeah, we'll still do this tomorrow. That's fine. Let's finish up. You can take a break. We've done a lot of notes.